this is going to sound very silly, but it does have some kind of potential for, the emancipation of human beings that.
Yeah, welcome. Thanks, Austin, for coming through.
Oh, hey, yeah, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to do it.
Yeah, awesome. So do you want to introduce yourself? I don't know, people probably know.
My name's Austin English. I'm a cartoonist. I've done books called Meskin and Mezzo and Gulag Casual. I write about comics for the Comics Journal. I do editing work for them. And I run a company called Domino Books that publishes work, but most of what Domino does is it distributes work. I try to just take work from all around the world. Sometimes work that isn't even necessarily work that I understand or is in my in my world of things that I'm completely behind, but I see something in it that's more interesting than my taste. I think my own taste is not so interesting on its own. So a lot of what Domino does is I kind of go around and I try to build this store that buys self-published work from as many people as I can that I find interesting in some way. And I like to think of the store as some kind of representation of everything that's happening right now and not try to have one particular aesthetic, try to bring in as many aesthetics as possible to kind of really to prove a point about, I guess in some ways I always felt my work and work I liked, people would talk about it early on when I was doing it and say, oh, this work's very strange or weird, or is it even comics? And to me, there's so much work that's done in that kind of tradition. So I thought bringing tons of stuff together really proves a point and can kind of slowly change people's opinions about comics from putting hundreds and hundreds of comics in envelopes every month for over 10 years. And yeah.
That's so cool.
Yeah, it rules. And I think we always put a little bar of anytime we mention someone on the show, a little bar pops up and we give a shout out to them or whatever. I'm pretty sure Domino comes up in every episode.
Yeah.
So far at some point, either we've mentioned you or something you said or a book that you've put out, or it's a place, maybe the only place you can get something that we're talking about. And it's an amazing resource.
I see you guys have been talking about a lot of Domino related stuff. So it's nice
cool
to see.
You were in our first episode actually, and so it's you've always been in my mind to come on to talk comics with us because we thought it would be so fun. It's like going to the source. It was really interesting to hear you describe Domino as something you're not limiting it to only books with your taste. It's to have that presence of mind to be well, I want to incorporate things outside of my purview to increase the reach or it creates a bandwidth that is all encompassing. I think that is fascinating.
Yeah, I think we were talking about, I was telling you guys how I used to work at Forbidden Planet, and I think one of the interesting things that I learned early on working there was, I started working there in my early 20s, and the first day I was there, I might have in my mind thought, well, this is the kind of cartooning I like, this is the kind of line quality I like, this is the kind of mode of comics making that I'm interested in and going to try to recommend to people. And what happens quickly when you're working a comics retail job is someone will come in with a stack of books, and some of it will be your favorite books in the world, and then they'll also have books in there that in your mind you wanted to reject or you thought were completely uninteresting. And over time, you really your distinctions, your deeply held feelings about what's correct and what's incorrect in this medium, they really break down, and it really opens you up to things. And I think when I started Domino, there was all this kind of talk about curation, and there were lots of festivals that were less application based and more invite only. And there was a lot of kind of feeling of the importance of curation. And I definitely see the value of things like that, but I think there's something beyond one person's curation or a group of people's curation. I think there's something. I always think of if I bring in a book that maybe I don't understand, someone who does understand that book will become aware of the store and might recommend me something that I would have never heard of, and then the store kind of takes on an own, internal logic of its own. And I think that's much more interesting than your increasingly, I think as you get older, narrow taste. And so it keeps you, it keeps the thing beyond just any one person's mindset.
Yeah, that's great. And there's a quote that I think about all the time. I think I read this from the Pok Pok recipe book. Puck Puck was a Thai restaurant that used to be in Brooklyn. That's, I think, only in Oregon now. Anyway, that guy talks a lot about traveling, eating weird foods, and how when you eat a lot of food and a lot of different foods, especially regional foods that maybe you've never heard of before, that are like flavors you've never had ever. He's like, you start to be unable to like pinpoint whether you like it or not, but each time you try it, it's expanding your spectrum of experience. So like, if your spectrum is short, you have good and bad, good on one side, bad on the other side, mediocre in the middle. You might not be able to place the food, but it makes your spectrum wider. And so I think one of the things I like about seeking out new work and a lot of the things that you carry is it's like, if I read something, I don't know if I can say I liked it or didn't like it, but the experience of it was expanding in some way.
Yeah.
Which is something I seek out more often as I get older, is like, I don't want to just read something I know I'm going to like, or I don't avoid things that I know I'm going to dislike. I'm interested in making the spectrum as big as possible.
Yeah, and then you get into you do get into weird territories where if you like follow this mindset to its logical conclusions, it's like, well, what do you reject? What isn't valid? You know, like what is a comic where you can't hold yourself to this standard where like, well, all creation is equally important. I mean, you have distinctions, but I think it's like you train yourself to. I always think of this thing where it's like you don't hang out with people that are friends that are just completely in sync with you. You have all kinds of experiences with people, and some people you are completely opposed to the way you think. And I think art at its best is like that. There's things that you can get rather than syncing up entirely with the experience.
Yeah, it's good to argue. Like, arguing challenges your own feelings. It's
challenging was a word that I was gonna. Yeah, that came up in my mind. It's like
you don't
challenging your
man.
challenging your conception of what's acceptable. Like you're saying, broadens your scope. It broadens your frame of reference. But I thought that was really interesting what you were saying about like how over time your conceptions of what you deem acceptable break down.
Yeah.
And then that creates fertile soil for new things to grow. I really do like this journey of recording these and looking at books in part for me has been all about discovery and being curious and like saying, okay, there are a million people making comics. So what are they making? Why are they making it? Where does it come from? Trace its roots, see new stuff.
Yeah.
Have all these circles overlap until it all just creates some sort of like cognitive super whatever, some kind of fertile soil, like I was saying before, I think is a better analogy for like stuff to grow, like a compost heap of just everything.
Yeah. And as artists who are making our own work, like I'm always trying to draw in new ways and do new things, and I think seeing a broader variety of other people's work helps me say like, oh, there's still new territory to explore, there's still new depths to plumb in my own abilities, and like get out of your comfort zone, and it just keeps you hungry for making things, really.
And so it's a joy to have you on and to say, bring some books that you find fascinating and like connect some of that tissue to where you come into comics, into that conversation, because you were being modest before when you're introducing yourself. And I came up with a little list, and as I was writing down stuff, I was like, okay, artist, author, curator, editor, has this wonderful store that distributes all this amazing work, but the list doesn't stop there. Like, did I say editor already? And it just keeps going. And I was so impressed when I was like writing down all the things that you're responsible for. And at the end, in with artist is emissary of comics, like just an emissary for comics out there. And to find you so relatable and to have you come on the show, just joy. It's a pure joy.
It's sickening. It's too much stuff.
too wonderful. We were talking about having like Mike and I were talking about having relationships, like how if you only spend all your time at your desk, you steep your brain in your own juices so much at risk of being like a troll or something. You turn into some person who thinks that their ideas are always right. And so whenever I'm met with somebody who does so many things, like you're also an educator, an orator, you host the New York Comic Symposium, sometimes you're at Desert Island pulling shifts. I'm like, you're doing everything. Yeah. I'm like, so how do you balance all that with like, what does that work-life balance look like? Because you're responsible for so much work.
I think it's definitely hurt making artwork in the last year, just because some other stuff. I think because the other stuff I do has just kind of, it's just kind of keeps adding to it, and it becomes hard to manage all of it. But I'm really trying to get better about that. But I kind of think of it as all one thing. I think I was saying a little bit about this earlier, where I I think it all adds up to some kind of statement about what comics. I mean, truth be told, I do think comics have this potential that is rarely reached, and I do think it's still a medium that's finding its. I mean, it's finding what it can do, and I think there's been a lot of, as every medium has had, there's been a lot of misdirection of maybe what the capability of the medium is, and for whatever reason, I've been involved with it for so long, I do feel like there's all these, I'm an incrementalist, and I think there's all these little things you can do that can slowly shift what this art form can do, and I do think because it's an art form that can be made cheaply and uses, it could even be, you could be illiterate and make a comic, and you could have access to very few materials and not have a written language that you can work with. I do think it has some kind of potential for this is going to sound very silly, but it does have some kind of potential for, the emancipation of human beings that other art forms will also have, but I think comics' role in it is largely unexplored, and I think it's been weighted so much to be a purely commercial medium or a purely genre medium, and there's, I love genre comics and I love commercial comics as much as anything else, but I do think there's some real nuts and bolts potential for this medium and its role in the world. And I think there's all these. There's no way that you can enact these things overnight. I do think there's constant advocacy day to day, working with things, showing not just different ways of making work, but different ways that the medium expressed itself maybe 100 years ago and different directions it took that aren't bad or good, but put it into a certain corner, and trying to untangle some of those things. And I really do think with Domino, putting hundreds of comic books in the mail that are that might not, maybe 60% of them wouldn't be seen if I wasn't working with them in the way that I'm working with them. I do think over a decade that has an effect, and I think all of it works together towards whatever my political goal or whatever my political idea about comics isn't completely set in stone, but I have some general sense of what it is, and I feel like, I don't want to miss an area that some kind of good work can be done.
Well said. I think the transcendence of human potential is a good aspiration for the comics medium.
I mean, I feel really silly saying it. I should just say
No,
but
I was
do,
thinking.
Yeah.
I was thinking it as you were leading up to it, and I was like, how's he gonna phrase it? How's he gonna phrase it?
Go there.
I was like, yes.
I have a big problem with I have certain political ideals, and relating those to your day-to-day life, your personal life. I think that's definitely the way to madness. But I do think comics are so much a part of my life, and then finding some kind of way that they sync up with wider ideals that are the connection between art and these ideals might not be completely clear, but I have some sense of how I think they can be made to connect, or how they already connect and just need to be illuminated. So
yeah, I mean, but I think like the accessibility to these things and the easy accessibility, and like you said, cheap reproduction, and I don't know, it's the quickest way to get from one person's brain to another person's brain most directly without an intermediary.
Yeah, and I think like if you're writing a book, you'll write a sentence and you're using text, and even if you're writing poetically or you're writing extremely expressively, the letters that express like they sat in a chair, they're inherited, symbols. Like you didn't create, the alphabet that you're writing that sentence is, no matter what language you're writing in. But with comics, you do have your own, through your hand, you have your own symbol of drawing someone sitting in a chair. So it's such a the potential of that you're creating your own language. Every single cartoonist, whether you love them or not, they're drawing things in their own way. No one is exactly like any other cartoonist. Even people that are very derivative, they do bring their own kind of language to everything they draw, and I do think that there's something really unexplored about that, and it has some potential that I don't know if we'll see in our lifetime, but at some point it will.
And I think that's worth working, and it's a good I think, segue into exploring some of the work that we have here.
Totally, yeah.
So would you?
Yeah,
bring
what did
over?
you bring us today?
I really love this artist, Anke Fuchtenberger. And I do think one thing with Domino is years ago, when I worked at Forbidden Planet, I got some imported Anke Fuchtenberger books from this cartoonist and publisher, Dylan Williams. He was trying to distribute her work, kind of like how I do now, from her Belgian publisher, Breeze. And I used to be the buyer for the indie, artsy, mini comic section of Forbidden Planet. And it was a great job because I kept expanding the section, putting all this stuff in it. And Anke Fuchtenberger's work was so important to me, and I would try to hand sell it to everybody who came in the store, and some adventurous readers would buy it, but for the most part, it was pretty out there for people. So we would have certain books of hers in stock for years and years, and they would get shop worn or whatever. Now with Domino, I'm really proud that people really seem to have that sounds like it's something that it's Anke's fault or something. But I think people's idea of this being a comic and something that they're as interested in reading as, not to the same degree, but they're interested in reading her, they're interested in reading someone like Michael DeForge. I think her work is starting to make more sense to people that consider themselves interested in comics as an art form. It's not too extreme for them. And I've seen that shift happen over the years. New York Review of Books just did a collection of her most well-known work, W the Whore, which she did with Catherine DeVries. Yeah, this is her solo work. And I just think for whatever potential that we're talking about with the medium, I'll flip to one of these short stories. Maybe we could just...
This is a collection of short stories?
Yeah. And it's she works with Catherine DeVries on other stuff, but this is done... This is the work in here. This one has collaboration with Catherine DeVries as well, but some of it is solo.
What's the collaboration? Do they write it together? Or?
Well, that's part of what makes it so interesting, in that with the W the Whore work, Catherine DeVries had these blocks of text that she shared with Fuchtenberger, and Fuchtenberger was allowed to interpret it in any way that she wanted to. Now, what she talks about is sometimes what she would represent visually would be in contradiction of the text that DeVries supplied her with, but she talks a lot about the consequence of what she draws. So she's making a comic, not necessarily... her work, if you really look at it, is very linear, and you can really follow it along. I don't find it abstract or incomprehensible at all, but she has this idea of the consequence of a drawing. So she'll start doing something, and the plan of her work, one way to think about it, or one way she's talked about it, is to follow that consequence. So she has these, she starts with these drawings, and then, there's these pots, and then the consequence of that kind of leads to this. There's this growth. This isn't necessarily planned out in advance, but it's not completely improvised either, because you take the consequence of this growth, and then this shape. We have this shape here, someone with a parasol, and then as you keep going, this hair kind of has some kind of relationship to the consequence of having drawn this. So there's some kind of it's not completely like I'm drawing whatever I want, panel to panel. It's much more, it's a completely different way of thinking about comics. And then as you go on, you have these repeated shapes that start interlocking with each other. And you have this character start running. It's much more interesting just to look at it without me talking, although people listening to this as they're doing their dishes or something.
I love
that. You have to look at the screen.
Yeah, I love that phrase, the consequence of the drawing, though. That puts to words something I think about a lot, just about drawing straight to the paper, straight pen to paper or something, is and something I tell my students all the time too, which is put a shape down and then see what happens. And it's more, but the consequence phrasing of that is really nice.
The causality.
Yeah, and so then it's with that, we have this shape, we have these shapes, we have this shape, and then at this point, his twig of hair becomes like a propeller, and so we have this kind of rhyme happening here, and then grabbing him, and so you could maybe sit down and write some kind of story like this, but I don't think you'd get at it as powerfully if it's not more about what are the things I've begun drawing and what does that, I mean, one, maybe the simple way you can think about what she's doing is she's like, this shape inspires me to do another shape. As we all draw, and sometimes to me the way I draw is the more I'm working, the more visual ideas generate. And I think that's part of what she's doing, but it's also not just the pleasure of a new visual idea based on shapes she's drawn before. I think it's how does the consequence of some of my early drawings, what does that dictate I start doing? And she has to find that through working. And some of this guy's picked up, he's thrown into the air. Then the propeller kind of like cuts his head in half. And then, you have these things start happening that you sense that now she's maybe like working a little bit more in terms of writing and working with what's been set up. But I'm really influenced by the work of Lionel Feininger, where it's more about kind of guiding your eyes through this almost roller coaster of imagery and the sensation you feel as you're looking at these things. And I think, they're both German cartoonists. I mean, if you think of, Feininger did some of his work in America, but there is, to me, I see like a tradition that they both share. Just these beautiful images.
I saw recently one of our Chrome accounts posted a drawing he did, a dream image he did of Eileen where her head was half black like that. It just came up in my feed the other day.
This is interesting too, because it's like you think at the beginning this is maybe a shadow on her face from the parasol, but it continues on later as maybe this sort of mask or this kind of
or like typifies a certain type of creature or something.
Yeah.
And it's like I'm saying, oh, it's this visual rhyme that's syncing up with this visual rhyme, and that's the consequence that she's working with. I mean, I might be wrong about that, but to me, that's the consequence I see. And I just think I think maybe one of my big interests with her is that there's all these kind of iconic ideas about what comics are. They're a medium that relays information very clearly. And I think part of the dysfunction comics tend to have is that someone who has artistic inclinations might look at comics as they present themselves to the public, and they're like, oh, well, it's such a technical medium. It's a pure storytelling medium. It's about conveying information. This is not the medium for me. I might go into expressive painting or something like that. But I do think this work is such pure comics to me, and I think the more work is seen like this, the more people who work in this mode that are meant to be cartoonists, that are meant to tell visual stories, but not in a purely information-based way, might be attracted to the medium, and we have no idea what that would create and what that would do.
What that contributes. Yeah, that's really well said. I think that's so true. Like, the idea that the craft would keep people out, right? They'd look at it and go like, nah. Right, like that's too much.
Or that there's rules or things that you need to understand. It's a barrier I have a lot for like trying to learn about music or something. That musicians are always telling me like, just do music like the way you draw, just like kind of figure it out and wing it. And I'm like, no, but music has notes and keys and scales, and you gotta know the rules first. And they're like, no, you don't. It's the same thing I tell kids about drawing, or I tell friends about making comics or something. Like, you don't have to. There is no barrier for entry.
Right.
Unless your expression, it's like someone like, I know you have a Dan Klaus Monica criticism. He's a good example to talk of. Like Dan Klaus' work, I think his expression is it's about attaining a certain level. That's his expression.
Sure.
And I think, but other art forms, painting, music, whatever, they've gone through centuries of debate about getting rid of rules, then them reemerging for certain people. Those are open mediums where I feel like comics hasn't even like really confronted modernism, let alone postmodernism. It's like we're still in like kind of this like Errol Flynn mode. Sorry,
I was gonna say, do you think that has something to do with like music, film, visual art has this incredible wealth of criticism and writing about it? Do you think comics is lacking some kind of like, I don't want to say intelligentsia, but like a level of critical thinking that artists can then push against that? Because that's kind of how movements work, right? You're pushing against established rules and things like that. And I wonder if comics is maybe lacking a wide range of
that might be
critical writing about or something.
I don't know. I mean, that's probably one of the reasons. I mean, I don't think I teach a comics criticism class at SVA, and the class is supposed to be a semester of looking at critical works about comics, writing about comics. And honestly, I mean, I don't think you can fill a semester with writing about comics. 'Cause, I mean, as someone who writes about comics and cares deeply about a lot of people who write about comics, I just don't think there's a wealth of good comics criticism. Film criticism, art criticism, yeah, you'd need semester upon semester to get to everything. But I don't think comics really has that. So that's probably one of the... I mean, I think about it all the time.
Can I flip through this?
Yeah, sure. But at the same time, I do think there are so many masterful comics that do embrace the potential of what the medium can do. So I don't think of it as being barred from doing what it does. I do think the public perception of it is kind of very rule-based. But I also see that breaking down.
Yeah. And I think the origin of the medium, at least here in the States, contributes to that as well, right? In Europe, it's a different approach, like the bande dessinée, the ninth art. Like, it's actually respected as an art form in a way that it hasn't been here for a long time. It was like commercial or a throwaway type of medium, at least it is said. And seeing that break down just in our lifetime is exciting enough.
But I also think, like, European graphic novel culture, like we were talking about, like the distinction between like cinema, films, and movies, like the highest art movies, and then like the pleasure of like like Dumb and Dumber or something.
Sure.
And then like films are like the bad middle, where it's like like
Good Will Hunting.
Yeah, Good Will Hunting.
I wrote the script where I'm a genius,
right, like
and
the
I'm
Johnny
too
Depp
much of a genius.
Chocolat or something like that. But I do think a lot of French graphic novels. I mean, they have. In a way, that's really good. They have a lot of film type graphic novels, but they do. I mean, it makes it a mass medium to a degree over there, that they have that solid center.
Yeah.
When I was in Canada for TCAF, a lot of the Canadian cartoonists were saying, "Well, I can just write for a grant and get the grant from the government to fund my comics project so that I can print it and distribute it."
Yeah, you see that in the indie scene all the time.
And I was like,
fund. Yeah.
I was like, we don't have that where I'm from.
But I think we're in a better spot in America for comics at their most wild, because I don't want to speak to everything in Europe, because that would be ridiculous. But
sure.
I don't think the self-publishing, especially what we see in New York and a lot of what you guys have talked about on previous episodes, how rich the self-publishing is in terms of how deeply it's trying to go in all different kinds of directions. I mean, I think right now it's such a flowering of there's always been I think self-published comics in the US have always been incredible, and I think right now is a real golden age of it. And I just don't I think maybe our lack of grants and our lack of support makes people do it in the way that they do it here. I mean, there's absolutely no approval to seek except what your peers are thinking or what you can do, and I think that creates a lot of good work.
I wouldn't mind like a whatchamacallit, a Xeric grant.
Xeric grant?
That was a great one.
I think that wasn't like any kind of based on merit, was it? It was just you have a proposal for what
it was curated. Yeah,
That's
you
true.
had to submit a
That's
proposal.
true. You didn't win, I guess.
You had to deliver it, but that was all turtle powered, That was like
Yeah. Well, I think the Xeric grant is a lot better than crowdfunding, because you have to come up with a real plan for getting it into stores, and then you're not just directly selling it to your group of online followers. It's going to go out to the world and
yeah, I mean, I love that like Juliet and Austin are setting up a table in Washington Square Park and just peddling their wares to whoever comes by.
Oh, not me. Yeah.
Ashton.
Oh, Ashton. Yeah.
Ashton. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
what did I say?
I think you said Austin, but that's
Austin.
but
Sorry.
I'm
Sorry, I meant Ashton. Yeah, sorry.
No, it's very cool that they do that.
Yeah, I think I like that idea a lot. I pitched that to Josh, and he was like, I don't want to get into debates with the public about my work. And I was like, yeah, fair enough. I was like, but that's where strength in numbers comes from, right? You're sitting there with 10 other cartoonists. You can quickly shuffle off somebody if they're not being nice,
Mm-hmm.
Well, you can sell literature in New York without a license, and comics is included in that.
So it's a freedom of speech thing, or the
like
disseminating free
sloganeering,
speech?
Probably like people selling their tracks on the street. Yeah, that's probably
some 200-year-old law or something. Yeah.
I have a tax ID, a tax stamp, and that's the only thing that a cop has ever asked me for. Whenever I've been set up on the street, they're just like, "Do you have your tax stamp?" Yeah, you just fill out a form online, and they send you a little orange thing that says you're going to pay your taxes quarterly now. And then you're free to sell whatever you want on the street.
Oh, I didn't even know you needed that. But
I
yeah,
didn't
that's.
either.
I don't think you need it, like you're saying, for literature, but your average walk the beat cop, if they're trying to give you a hard time, that's what they're going to
It
ask
makes
for.
them feel like they're doing something.
Exactly. And once a cop asks you a question, then you're embroiled in their whole, it or whatever. Like you're now in their world. So it's like if they ask you, do you have your tax stamp, and you say no, then they go kick rocks, and you have to say okay, otherwise there's a problem.
If you have your tax stamp, they're like, okay, it's okay if you sell this
they're like,
weird pornography.
Yeah.
on the street.
They're like,
That's
you're fine. You're fine.
That has police officers dying in it or something.
Yeah. They don't care. They just, they're out there. They're the mall cops.
I'm curious about this.
This looks interesting.
This is Dorothea Iannone. She passed away, I believe, a couple years ago. I think at age 90, and she's someone who I didn't know anything about her work until I believe it was a show at the New Museum, and I missed the show. But they had this beautiful book from Siglio Press in the museum gift shop, and I think I was waiting for someone, and I sat and read this story. And to me, just here's another person. I kind of brought it in today as someone who's just, she has some, there's some knowledge of her in the art world, but I don't think she was ever, her partner, Dieter Roth, was a big art star, and I think to some degree, I don't know her biography that much outside of reading her work, but I think her career was a bit in the shadow of his. But in terms of comics culture, I've never seen her really mentioned or talked about. But if you look, and she made these art books. They'd be, I believe, editions of one or maybe a few editions. But they would be visual narratives. And if you look at it, I mean, this looks like something that you might see at a avant-garde comics fest or something, if it was just printed in zine form. And she did these, I believe, in the 70s, 1978. And I just, I know you guys have talked about E.A. Bethea on the show, and I think there's something about just sitting down and reading Dorothea Iannone's work where it might have, it might look like this out there work or work that isn't traditional in some way, but the expression of it, like Bethea's work, is so direct, and the feelings that she expresses. I mean, she's telling just a story of beginning a relationship with someone, and I just find the writing so beautiful, but it couldn't be reduced from the imagery. I mean, I think they both are completely intertwined, and I find her work incredible, and I just want to always recommend this specific book to people from Siglio Press, because it collects, she's done more work than this, but it collects her most, it's just the best, in terms of curation. Lisa Pearson, who runs this press, just did such an incredible job getting the best of her work. So if you're interested in Dorothea Iannone at all, this isn't just a good introduction to her work. This is just a beautifully edited book. And Siglio Press does so much stuff that's, they've done Joe Brainerd books, they do Ray Johnson books. So they tend to specialize in people who, for better or for worse, you might know them from the art world, but they are people who work with text and imagery, not in a superficial way, but in a deeply intertwined way. And cool. But who I think, unfortunately, I love Jack Kirby, I love Steve Gerber. So those are some of my favorite people who work in comics. But I think we could have maybe 5, if we're talking about writing about comics, we could have maybe 5 or 6 more articles about Dorothea Iannone as someone who works with comics language before the next 20 Jack Kirby articles.
Yes, fair enough.
Maybe something about comics too is there's maybe people are too interested in maintaining the greats or maintaining the reverence for the greats. There's not enough incorporation, and maybe that goes back to the movements thing. There's not enough movements in comics. It's just these are the greats and that's that. And if you were to divide up comics into separate areas, you would have, the abstract expressionists, the realists, the pop artists, whatever. And when we have fewer people trying to reinforce those established greats over and over again.
It's a concentration of commercial, work that is commercially successful as well. So it went out to a whole populace when they were a certain age. Right. Those people grow, have kids, and then hand those books to their kids. If that's all they ever see,
right? It's like saying that Van Gogh is only the best painter, and you talk about Van Gogh always as the best or something,
right? Yeah, or how you see just Picasso work when you grow up in Middle America, and then you come to the city thinking about fine art.
Yeah,
you're like Picasso, right? And they're like, look at all this stuff.
Yeah,
and they're like, oh my god.
But I do think there's something where maybe people who go to Midtown Comics every Wednesday. I'm not necessarily saying those people need to be aware of Dorothy Iannone, because there's people who make beautiful films that were reared on blockbuster movies, and they make their own expressive blockbuster movies. So I'm not. It's not about necessarily like pounding into people's heads that have completely different interests. Oh, this is a comic too. I don't think that that's so interesting. It's more about the potential of comics language and combining text and imagery. And when someone hears that and they're like, okay, I make images and I also work with text, and then they go into a graphic novel section and they're like, hi, I'm interested in the idea of a combination of image and text, and someone's like, oh, here's Preacher by Garth Ennis and Steve Dillon. And they're like, okay, well, this is interesting, but this isn't exactly where I'm coming from.
Yeah.
If this is part of that, if this is part of that section, I think, I guess, my deep thing is that I'm afraid of losing people who might be able to use this medium in a beautiful way.
Yeah.
And we're not going to lose the next Garth Ennis. I think
yeah.
he'll probably come to comics. We're not going to lose the next Jack Kirby or something, but people who work this way, I do think that there's a potential that they really do have something beautiful to communicate to people, and more immersion, I think would, in works like this, helps them form what they're going to do, rather than just creating something in a complete vacuum.
Gives them permission.
I was just going to say, something we talk about is that idea of permission, and certain artists are able to unlock, like, oh, I can do that, you can do that, like, I didn't, not that you were forbidden to do it, but that you now have the confidence to do something in a direction that you would have given up on because you felt like it's outside the purview of what's allowed.
Yeah.
It blocks out possibility. Without exposure, you are blocked because you cannot see what is possible. And when you see what is possible, then all of a sudden you give yourself permission to take your work even further. Down that same path, perhaps, down a different path. You're simply, for lack of a better word, inspired, but it's the exposure that unlocks the possibility. It's like you've gained access to a whole nother floor in the hotel of your brain. Like, oh, there's more up here? Like, I didn't know it went that high. I didn't know that the elevator could take me to that level.
Yeah.
Or it sets a standard where you're like, okay, if you're like, maybe you're working in this way and you go into that bookstore and they're like, yeah, sure. And they're like, I mean, maybe, I like Preacher, so that's a bad example.
Preacher's fine.
But they're like, what would be something?
Dan Klaus.
Yeah, well, Dan Klaus would be good. Dan Klaus would be a good thing to show to anybody.
I'm just kidding.
Whoever you consider, like, maybe some kind of infographic-y comic, whatever. It doesn't matter. We don't need to throw anyone under the bus.
X.
But if you see that, then you're like, okay, well, what I'm doing is unique from this. I'm going to continue doing it, but there's no. I'm going to start from scratch. I think if you see something like this, or you see something like Ankte Fuchtenberger, you're like, okay, well, there's a standard here. People prior to me have thought about this, and I can build my unique expression from this. I mean, that's how most art mediums work. It's aside from a canon, there's clearly identifiable examples that you're not necessarily gonna be derivative of, but you have some kind of context for. Okay, people have thought in this way. And I have a standard that's already set. And I do think for people working in this way, what the standard is or what's come before is largely invisible. For people who want to work like Jack Kirby, that's not so invisible.
Right. And that's something that a lot of kids will automatically do. Like, I know I grew up drawing X-Men, copying X-Men stuff.
Yeah.
And like you're gonna naturally come to some of these influences because they're so popular, and there's so many visual styles are built on these kind of classic examples, I guess, or these established examples that you don't get out of that unless you kind of seek it out.
Yeah.
You won't get out of that mode unless you have an adventurous spirit. These recipes?
Some of them. These notebook pages are wild. They kind of remind me of the syllabus and the other comics instruction from Linda Berry's
book. Yeah. I could see that.
Yeah, I mean, everything she does in these books is a combination of text and imagery. And I it's not just the novelty of that. I think her narrative stories are, I mean, I just can't recommend them enough. They're deeply affecting and beautifully told. And they really come from a very passionate place, but not a completely unedited passionate place. I mean, I think she really takes writing seriously and really takes, as any cartoonist should, but doesn't always do, she takes what the balance of her imagery and text is very seriously. It's a unity, and I think
And there's a healthy dose of genitals in there, which I know Mikey likes.
Well, I
it's
mean,
very.
It
We were talking about the
took me a
merits.
while to build that confidence, and I needed something like this to give me the permission.
We were talking about the merits of not being afraid of your own body and how that's connected to creative endeavor, but creative energy in specific, and how important that is.
Yeah, I don't think Dorothy Iannone is afraid of her own body.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, that's why I brought it up. I mean, yeah, I saw an opportunity to make a little joke, which is much in my style. But I also think
are
it's
beautiful,
very
though.
important that we are, like I say almost every episode, the opposite of war is sex.
Yeah.
Not peace.
Creation.
You say that every
Creation.
episode?
I mean, quite often.
That's going to be our first T-shirt.
Well, I say that often because, I'm at odds with the culture in which I was raised. It's a very violent one. And so I think people raised in that culture are quick to kind of get real stiff and strange when it comes to depictions of human bodies.
Yeah.
And I want to start to break down why that is and build some thought around maybe it's because we're being programmed to violent ends and violent means for violent ends.
Well, there's a good talk with the person who published this book, Lisa Pearson, that I did for the New York Comic Symposium. And she talked about, the erotic nature of Dorothy Iannone's work. And I can't remember exactly what she said. I don't want to contradict it. But she talked about that, that interest for Dorothy Iannone was that she just thought of, physical connection between people being the ultimate connection. And it wasn't necessarily something meant to be titillating or whatever. I mean, I don't think she was concerned whether it was or it wasn't, but it had a real meaning to her, and it was a very important thing for her too.
Yeah, and it's revealing. I feel like whenever I come across, I'm always interested in people who draw whatever you would call it, erotic art or nude art or pornographic art. Because I think there is something like, if someone's willing to put something like this out there, I'm immediately like, okay, this person is not afraid of sharing something. Like, they're not afraid of sharing anything. I think if I come across work like this, I'm like, I know I'm getting an authentic version of this person because they're clearly not editing what they're interested in drawing.
Yeah.
And that makes me want to see more of it and engage with what they're writing about.
I wonder how much they were influenced by some of the art of the Kama Sutra, because there's some of the way the bodies are positioned and splayed, the arrangement of the physical bodies reminds me of some of that work that I've seen associated with that.
This kind of stuff is so lovely too, and this does have that quality of just spontaneous mark making that really makes me want to stop and go draw. That we talk about a lot. Like the books that we get the most hyped about are the ones where you're just like, I want to do something. I don't want to do this, but I want to do I want to make something that makes other people feel the way I feel about looking about this.
Yeah. I think there's the example of Mark Beyer in comics that people know that you could maybe liken her to. I think she's a little more, I would say a lot more naturally skilled than Mark Beyer, but I do think there's a lot of Mark Beyer awareness in comics and a lot of love for him, but I do think that I'm glad this book exists. I do wish that there was maybe
I'd like to pick
a couple
this up
more
at some point.
affordable editions of it. But Siglio Press in general, I think a great publisher for this kind of work.
Is this book still in print right now?
I believe so, yes.
Okay,
I mean,
cool.
I was selling it in the Domino store. It's been a little bit since I tried to reorder it, but I believe it's still available.
Okay.
Cool. Yeah, Mike and I were both like, well, there's all these books we want from Domino. Should we ask them to bring them?
I was like, I think
And
it's a
we're
bad
That's
look.
not cool.
That's a bad look.
That's not a good look. And I was like, sales are sales. Maybe he'd be into it. And I was like, we'll just order them.
Yeah.
I think the first time I saw your work, Mike, in a shop, you'd ordered stuff from the Domino store, and I write everyone a carbon receipt.
Yeah.
And the cover to your comic, because I just my handwriting's really bad, especially when I'm not thinking about it. I'm not forcing myself to focus. And I kind of just scrawled your name really quickly on the sheet, and you scan that, and that was
It's
how
on
your
the
name
cover,
was
yeah.
represented on the cover.
Yeah, I'm glad you recognize it. That's
Yeah.
fun. That's a fun little tidbit.
The first time I ever saw you was at Brooklyn Arts Festival, or CAB, at Comics Arts Brooklyn. You were interviewing Olivier Schrauen.
Oh god, I did a really bad job with that. That's one of the worst. Anyway.
I'm just saying that I was there and I was writing everything down. I was journaling really heavily at that point, and I had written everything down.
So now it's preserved
Oh, God.
forever.
Well, so anyway, long story short, the only reason I mention it is because that was the first time I ever saw you. That was the first time I ever heard the name.
You kept in contact with me after that.
Well,
that
I'm a fan. I think you're a positive force in comics, and that's the best thing. I think that
I still am. Yeah, that panel really worked out badly, and it's.
I'm sorry.
Oh no, it's not a big deal.
I'm sorry,
I'm glad to talk about it on the record now.
We
in
can
case
always
anyone else
edit
was
it
there.
out,
No, it's good. No, it's good. It's good.
Cool.
What
what else we
let
got?
me ask about Matati, because
Wait, you're a Matati.
Matati is one of my favorites, and I've never seen this Chimera work before.
Yeah, this is part of the old Ignatz line that Fantagraphics was doing with
because I see
Coconino.
Coconino, yeah.
It was this interesting thing where they were publishing works simultaneously in different languages, and it was like in the mid-aughts, and it was kind of like a compromise between graphic novels and floppy comics. The line did not work out.
This is unbelievable.
But I do think...
I want to grab it.
Oh, yeah, sure.
I'm like, whoa, let me see
I
that part.
had seen this story before when I was still in high school, I believe, in this anthology called Mona, which was really, really... It was a kitchen sink anthology. I want to say it was... Oh, God, I'm going to forget who edited it. Robert Cook, I want to say. And it had a Jaime Hernandez cover. It had this entire story. It had... a Southern cartoonist named Matthew Guest. It was a really just very solid, beautiful. It was very formative to me to see at the time. I think it was just a one shot, but the work was kind of shrunk down.
Oh my God, that's amazing.
But this is just a
I used to have this
except for this, a completely silent comic, and I'm just fascinated by. This was my first exposure to Matodi. But yeah, anyone who... Well, what are your thoughts on Matodi?
Well, I have that book, Garlandia, which I just picked up randomly at Desert Island one time.
That's a huge one?
Is huge. And you know what? One of the things I credit about that book, Fantagraphics put it out, they use a lighter newsprint stock in it because it's 400 pages or something, and it should weigh 30 pounds, but it weighs barely 5. It's very light. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. But when I see this drawing, it reminds me of James Thurber, kind of this very thin line drawing, obviously from a dip pen, right? But he goes to places that are just wild, using the black to such a degree. In this, it kind of creeps in, which is really nice, the way the black creeps in. But using it to this degree where the figures are tarnished, they're oozing out of some sort of primordial space, right?
Oh, wow.
He has a painter's approach to using ink, which I think is really fascinating. These marks, these slashy marks, look like 1,000 demons or something. It's insane the way that they're doing this almost Bacon-esque figure, this head disappearing. It's unbelievable to me. So I love the mark making.
So
I'm a
expressive.
huge fan.
I'm really fascinated by... I'll show this to students as a way of thinking about how you can build a comic where this drawing... I don't know if we zoom
pick
in
it
on
up.
You can pick it up, yeah.
this drawing, and then transitioning into this drawing, where it's kind of like what I was talking about with the Anke Fuchtenberger example, where I don't think there's any way you come to this drawing without drawing this first and allowing yourself to react to it. So it's a way of comics writing where I know he's, you read through it and there's things you could say about it, that has some statement about man's relationship to nature and one kind of physical form flowing into another. And I think those are goalposts he's hitting, but the real heart of the comic happens in moments like this where he's set up a structure and he might have to hit certain moments in that structure and get to it. But the way that he gets from one goalpost to another really is... I don't want to use the word improvise because I think that's not what it is, but that's maybe the easiest way to think about it, where there's an improvisation that happens from here to here, but it's also this kind of structured improvisation where he has this setup and he's drawing in this way, and then that improvisation becomes... What I don't like in experimental work or work in general is arbitrary choices. And so sometimes improvisation can just be used, I think, in an arbitrary way, but I think with him... There's this different kind of improvisation that happens from this clear focus on what he's doing, but it can only happen from reacting from one visual idea to another visual idea. And you see that kind of drive. Once you look at this and think of it as this in reaction to that, the whole comic kind of works in that way. And it has this beautiful, beautiful ending. I don't think this is something people need to worry about spoilers with. But yeah, you just have that figure there. I don't think you can write this panel, right? I think the beauty of that image, the way that this is written is all the drawing that comes before it, and then coming to that image, and then as it keeps going. I showed this
cool.
in classes, and I do it slide by slide, and this is always very dramatic when you go from
It looks like a Hugo Gilbert.
this to this to this, and then I start slowing the slides down when I get to this image, and then I find that really beautiful too, and then it ends here.
fascinating.
I also thought that this Ignatz line of books that Fantagraphics and Coconino were doing, to me this is like the ideal format. I think graphic novels are sometimes too, it's like asking every cartoonist to make an epic movie, like a 5-hour movie.
Yeah.
But I do think that, an alternative comic floppy format might be limiting to people. I think the size of this and just how they were printed, I think if you ever see these, even if it's an artist that you're less interested in than another, they're just a beautiful way to read comics.
Yeah, it's wonderful.
And
What is this?
it's something that's exciting about so many of the young artists, especially in New York now, are putting out these kind of nicely presented single issues. And Nick and I were talking, I think, off camera about like how many artists from the last 20 years have like 200 pages of a 500-page graphic novel they're never going to finish that no one will ever see. Like how many partially finished graphic novels are floating around in someone's basement somewhere, whereas this stuff is like, it's concise, it's sharp, it's expressive, it's exciting, and it's out, and you move on to the next thing.
Yeah, and it's completely ambitious. I mean, there's no... I tend to think that the 20 to 40 pages is the correct... Like, I don't think you're sacrificed. I don't like anthologies that have a bunch of 2-page stories, but I do think 20 to 40 pages is... That's the right balance.
Mm-hmm.
Not
I'm
for everyone,
recording.
but
That's
I mean...
what?
We're not only re-recording, but I'm recording this in my head. I'm like, all right, 20, 40 pages.
Well, I mean, it's
9 by
it's-
12.
it's
knock
a-
it off with the 2-page stories.
Yeah, it's something I think about with movies a lot too. Is like there are creative choices made under limitation. Right?
Who's
So,
that
like,
guy?
It's a thing where it's like if you watch a car movie from the 70s, it's more exciting to me because you know they were limited by how often they had to shoot. They
Yeah.
had to shoot with real cars.
Yeah.
Right,
and it's
right.
like if you watch. I mean, I don't have a problem with Fast and Furious movies, but those movies seem less dangerous, less exciting to me because you know they can do anything they want. And so there are creative choices that are made under the duress of these limitations that I find really exciting.
Yeah.
Because you feel the pressure of the limitations a little bit, and if anything can happen, it's like, well, there's no risk there here. There's
No
no danger.
stakes.
There's no stakes. Yeah.
Right, and so you're saying that like graphic novels, the length of them makes it so that you can technically do anything in your narrative. But it's
Maybe,
also
yeah.
also- yeah, no, I don't think every cartoonist is. I think Dash Shaw is a contemporary cartoonist too. That's how he works. He works in very long narratives, and it's correct for him. And manga artists work in that way. But I don't think it's right for as many people that it's kind of foisted upon.
Yeah, it's certainly something I'm just personally less interested in at the moment. Like I like this format a lot in terms of the concision. Is that a word? It's like how concise it can be. And
Yeah.
it's forcing you to distill what you want to say into a really doesn't have to be clear, but it's direct.
And also, I think like people know Matodi's work Fires. That's like one of his most famous works. And I think Fires is really beautiful. But there is, I think, sometimes his text can be a little. It can be a little corny or distract from things.
Might be the translation.
I think they're beautiful. I think like Fires is, it's if you're interested in comics as an art form, it's something you have to read, and it's incredible. But I do like this for him working silently, and it's just there's to me this is like a masterpiece comic. There's nothing that I would take away or want changed.
It's also like utterly terrifying, this image, and there's something about the blackness, the way it all just kind of coalesces.
Mark
really
painting
well.
is just astonishing.
Yeah, I mean he's incredibly. He's probably one of the most talented drawers imaginable.
Which of these texts should we talk about first?
We can talk about this one. I mean, these are just more. This is kind of like maybe my thinking. These are just books that help me form some of my thinking about art and maybe what I do with Domino. I really wanted to bring in a program for Anthology Film Archives, which is on Second and Second in New York.
Place.
And I think when I moved to New York in 2002, I hadn't heard about Anthology Film Archives before, but when I went there, this idea of a place that every day was showing, it was somewhat cheap, it was accessible, and they existed to show work on the margins, not just, there's repertory theaters in every city, and New York has them as well, good repertory theaters like Film Forum that will show, masterpieces of film art, but will, regularly do an Alfred Hitchcock retrospective. I was so amazed by Anthology Film Archives when I first encountered it that their program is you won't see those the movies that they show typically at other repertory film programs. They show work that's sometimes there aren't more prints of what they're showing, and it's really deeply challenging work, and they show it in an accessible, consistent way. They run Anthology Film Archives in, I think, a very sustainable way, and I think that it makes it makes the work that they show this work that could be completely unseen. They show it consistently, and it becomes this resource that whenever you're ready to encounter it, it's there, and it can have an effect on people that just stroll past the theater. There's no real bar of entry for this extremely complicated work that might not be seen otherwise. So with Domino, I should have brought in that program just as a visual representation of it, but that was a big formation on how I think of the potential of just distributing quote unquote complicated work and making it, doing it in a consistent professional way. I think really Anthology Film Archives programming had a deep effect on me, and I think of Domino as doing that for comics. This book by Richard Foreman, really just it's a lot of scripts of his plays, but what really
he's a playwright.
Yeah, but what really influenced me in this work is his thoughts on his process, and he makes very he's worked in New York his whole life. You can probably see his work. I think he's doing less plays than he used to. But his thoughts on how he creates was deeply formative to me, and I think he writes in here about an idea of what surrealism is, and it really connected with what I thought of as the real potential of surrealism. I think a lot of people now use the word surrealism to say something is weird or strange or dreamlike, but I think the real political possibility of surrealism is what he talks about a lot here, and I think I've seen some of his works performed, and I have to say his thoughts on how he thinks about his work is much more influential to me than his actual work. And so I just, this was a very formative book to me when I was young and thinking about this stuff. So I think anyone who sees this book or seeks it out, his introduction here is just, I find it's very clear language about very, I think, complicated ideas, and I really appreciate what's been written here.
So what is you were saying about surrealism, what is his take then on surrealism?
It's more this idea that, work can be created. It's like, he talks about, some people come to my plays, they're working through some kind of problem in their relationship, they're working through some kind of issues with their father, they come to a work of art, and they're like, okay, how's this work going to address my personal problems? How am I going to be affected by this? Or I want a melodramatic escape from what I'm doing. That's, in his idea, how most people come to theater or come to some public performance of art or to a film. And his work kind of relates to what I was talking about with this Anke Fuchtenberger work, where he's showing you these series of, people are saying things, and he's focusing on how what they're saying sounds. He's having certain contradicting sound effects happen. And so his work seems extremely abstract, but it's more about, he edits down the abstraction in this. I think that's what I've talked about with a lot of these people, that they might work in an improvisatory way, but they've really thought about, the editing is a big part of it. And so I think the sensations that you have in experiencing his work, they're not meant to be scatological, or they're not meant to be confounding. They're meant to affect you on a way that's apart from melodrama or apart from solving a problem. They're supposed to communicate a different kind of way of thinking about the reality we're all in, and not in a sci-fi way, in a way that there's, I think one of the ideas he talks about here is the real surrealist idea is there's another world, but it's in this one, and that's not some kind of metaphysical crazy idea. It's that there's a different way of relating to our own sensation of the world that's right there, and his work tries to illuminate that in some kind of way.
Is that the idea that through engaging with these kinds of surrealist works, we can unlock that or discover that world, or is that an entry point to it?
Or yeah, I mean, I think it's there, and I think it's just I think there's just a different. I mean, I think there's a different way of experiencing art than I just that's one of the things that I really remember. This idea that he feels that people come to his work and they have this personal problem, and how is this work of art going to address that? And there's a way to think of work beyond that, beyond some kind of melodramatic expression of work, some other kind of that also doesn't have to be thought of as just completely unrelatable and scatological. That there's sensations that are just as important as our foundation in melodrama.
Yeah, as if the abstraction can provide a multifaceted exposure somewhere, like a multifaceted abstract object that you bounce off of, and those because it's abstract or surreal in that way, it can kind of reflect back to people an evolution of their own emotional turmoil or tribulation, in which they're able to glean some sort of way out or over or through, as if it allows the expansion of consciousness through its kind of like approach, in that abstraction is multifaceted. Everyone gets their own experience and gets something that they take away. Whereas if it were very specific and, like you're saying, scatological, they wouldn't be able to relate in that way.
Yeah.
It's almost, the abstraction provides this generic like entry point where they're then able to project on it, and it helps them evolve.
Right. And
I think that's fascinating.
He also talks about these ideas of bringing in actors into his theater and looking at their just the way they carry themselves, and that providing some kind of basis for what he's doing. I mean, I'm sure a lot of traditional directors work in that way, but it's such a foundation for what he does, the way the clothes that people are wearing, and then another actor will come in and just allowing them to allowing these things that already exist in how they are, not imposing some kind of directorial voice where it's like, I'm in control of this. Like, it's a little bit what I talked about, the curation of Domino before, like seeing beyond your control of these things, what might be, what deeper thing might be communicated if you take a little bit of that control away.
And the nested world, like one world nested inside of another, I think is a fascinating concept.
Yeah.
That like in some way, if you're able to, whatever that means to you, access some other realm of experience, it somehow lightens yours, or it provides you opportunity to be in service of others, right? It's like, that is fascinating.
It could be frightening to some people too, I imagine. Like, you need to be open to this kind of exploration. There's something about like experimental work or surreal work or difficult work, whatever you want to call it, that I think some people are afraid of attempting to engage with. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, of like how to get people who are maybe hesitant to be vulnerable enough to engage with something like this. How do you get someone like that to be open enough to be receptive to what's good?
Around 10 years ago, I saw one of his plays at Roundhouse Place. What is it? The Public Theater.
Public
and
theater.
That place is awesome.
There was some. I think a lot of NYU students had gotten rush tickets or something, so it wasn't necessarily an audience that was in line with what he was doing.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember it was such an uncomfortable experience. You could just tell how people were, it's these characters repeating phrases constantly. They're dressed up in very elaborate costumes that have some kind of meaning that they, in the rehearsals of the play, they'll build on what these characters are going to wear. Then there's loud, discordant sounds. I mean, it's, if you're resistant to this stuff, it seems like self-parody. It's just like, okay, this guy's like Mr. Avant-Garde.
Right.
And so people were so resistant to it, and then when it ended, there was like no applause, and I just heard these NYU students going like, well, that was the worst thing I've ever seen in my life. But that's part of, I think, he talks in here where that's always something that has been a response to his work, and it's more like, so that's the experience you had, looking at that.
Right.
But I do think that my feeling about quote-unquote complicated work or experimental work, people's reception of it, is that I think real work is not, you might call it complicated, but there's no barrier between work like this in comparison to anything else. I think if you just come to work like this with no preconceptions and just allow, the meaning of the work is how it affects you. That's always my feeling. With all the stuff I've shown, I do not think his work or anyone's work is a puzzle to decode. If it is, I'm not that's the kind of work that I tend to not be interested in
Me
at
too,
all.
Yeah,
So I think a lot of people tend to think of work like this as like, okay, I've been taught about artwork. I know that there's a hidden sort of there's some subtext here that
Coded
I remember from
language,
English class, that okay, what are the themes and decoding it? What's my thesis on this? And that, I think, prevents people from experiencing work like this that I really think everyone is capable of having some kind of reaction to it, even if that reaction is boredom or rejection of it.
Right.
And it's like going from the outside in, trying to apply your intellect to create something that is honest when it should be coming from the inside out. What you were saying about people being like, afraid of work that they might find challenging, I really think that's comes from a place of like they're clinging to a convention of what reality is. And whenever you challenge what that convention may be or the potential for it to change, that's really upsetting to a lot of people.
Yeah,
it's like
conservative. It's true, like true conservative.
yeah, it's as if we're sitting on a thin layer of ice, and below us is this abyss that could literally be anything. And we can shape it into whatever we want, but we're clinging to this layer of ice because we think that if we step, it'll crack and we'll fall forever.
And you're afraid of what's beyond.
Yeah.
The comfort of that.
Right, and so it's the crisis of clinging to that like convention of reality. I always say that like television is self-perpetuating. Like it creates what it wants reality to be and reinforces it by constantly advertising itself within that reality. So it self-perpetuates a convention of reality. And I think that when you challenge what we've been raised on and what you believe reality is, that's when people go, I don't get art. I don't get it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think just presenting it without any kind of preconditions, I think the way that work like this gets presented usually is where the problem begins. I think if it's just presented as a simple thing that is open to anyone, I think that's where I don't think there's any barrier to this stuff.
Sure.
And I do think if that can somehow be communicated over time, I don't know. I mean, there's no
I think you're right.
There's no utopian project where because I think we see more and more like mainstream publishers or film studios, their work, I think, becomes more and more traditional. But I think you also see what the way people experience art. There's so many people watching these long YouTube documentaries about esoteric subjects or whatever,
Sure.
and I do think people are less concerned with things not having the structure that they're accustomed to.
That's
I
fair.
think like with students I teach at SVA, like I do think the effect of manga has made them, I feel like pre-manga being as dominant as it's been in the last 5 years, you might show work like this and they're so reared in, at the time, they're so reared in a Western direct market tradition of comics that they'd be more resistant. But whatever effect manga has had, when I'll show work like this, it seems more, they're more in line with it, or it just seems like anything else. Like I showed this work and I also showed Jack Kirby and Stan Lee's This Man, This Monster, and the work that wasn't liked was that Jack Kirby and Stan Lee work because for whatever manga has done,
Too busy.
It's too exactly. There was too much dialogue and there was too much. They really didn't like Stan Lee explaining what was happening in every panel.
Thank you.
And I think you might 5 years ago. I think that might have been considered. Well, this is how comics function. But I think now showing this work to 19 and 20-year-olds, I think they do. They don't need to be coaxed into it. They're like, oh, of course. Yeah.
It's funny when you said that because I thought of Matsumoto when I was looking at this.
Yeah.
And that's
Yeah.
probably just because I'm reading Sunny right now. But the other thing you said, which really stuck with me, was there's no barrier to entry if you come without preconceived notions. And I think that's even more difficult for people to do, to come to something without preconceived notions.
But maybe as people are seeking out all different kinds of media on their own, whether it's through
That's
YouTube
true.
or whatever, I think preconceived ideas about what a piece of art or information that you're going to interact with, I think it's definitely changing.
I think that's well said, yeah.
I think it's also existing at a time where like we are realizing every day the flaws in the established systems that we live in all the time. Like I think that might be a gateway into abstraction on its own, or whatever you want to call it, surrealism. Like we're realizing that, it used to be like, you go to college, you get a job, you stay at the job, you get a retirement, you can buy the house, you have a kid. Like there's like systems and things that people believe in, and the Democrats are going to take care of us, and we're going to be good. There's good guys, there's bad guys. There's all these like things that were kind of a given, And I think young people especially are starting to see these systems sort of erode and the flaws in these systems. And I wonder if that's a gateway into kind of just looking for alternatives to everything around
Yeah.
you. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think
That might
so.
be a leap.
I think
You-
so.
the YouTube reference is a good one too, because that's a perfect point and well mentioned, where you're like, they'll go listen to a 3-hour esoteric YouTube presentation. It's like, you're right, actually. People are really thirsty for information, and they want to get to try to unravel whatever they feel is their like personal mystery.
Yeah. Well, and
And-
people are really interacting, even if it's if it's work that has a worldview that's completely counter to mine. People are interacting with independent media
Yeah.
more. I mean, at least, who knows? I mean, we live in New York. Who knows?
it's a
I mean,
bubble
it
here.
seems like everybody's on board with what we're talking about here. But it's hard to say. But I do think, yeah. I mean, I can only speak to what I see. Students or younger, we all know this group of younger cartoonists in New York,
Yeah.
and they do seem pretty forward thinking in this mode of work
Yeah.
versus work that seemed dominant for so long.
Yeah, absolutely.
For sure. And it's exciting to see that it's not someone doing their take on another artist. Like, you see their influences coming from all over the place.
Yes.
And so then tell me about this book.
I just wanted to bring this up as something that's, because I also write about comics and do all this work for the Comics Journal. And a lot of my ideas about criticism, this is just a famous book of literary criticism by Lionel Trilling called The Liberal Imagination. And this book has just been so formative to me in thinking about art and someone responding to art. When I have students write about comics, I try to instill this idea that you're not writing a consumer guide. You're not saying this work is good, this work is bad. You're looking at what the work does, and you're assuming that it's legit in some kind of way. And you're talking about when someone takes in this work and they step out into the world, what the consequences of this work is, and how someone interacting with its work, what it means in the world that it was created in after it was ingested. And I do think, and the other thing that I try to get people to write about art with, and I try to hold myself to this standard, is to not ignore any aspect of a work of art, to look at how it presents itself, the contradictions within that work of art, and to come to some real grappling with it that gets at the totality of the work, that doesn't cherry pick. I mean, that's what you're told in school when you write about things, to not cherry pick your arguments. But I don't think you can be told that. But I think in terms of reading someone who really does that to a masterful degree, I just can't recommend this work enough. As it starts off with this this essay, Reality in America, and it talks about this literary critic that Trilling is attacking. And he takes the writer's argument at face value and then just looks at every sentence of it and really comes to an understanding of what this person is missing in their argument and what the real meaning of them having these attitudes is. And so it's not as exciting to look at as the other work we have here. But
It's a huge recommendation.
I can't, as you can see, it's pretty
It's well
worn.
worn.
It's
Yeah,
well
I was
worn.
like, look at the notes. I'm like, look at how well loved it is. I'm like, it's a reference when there's ink stains on it. Like,
Yeah.
all my favorite books have ink stains on it, and I am always bemoaning, like, oh no, I got ink on that book, and then afterwards I'm like, oh no, that's my book.
Yeah.
Like, that's my book.
So would it be possible now to do that type of essay with comics, where you're thoroughly dissecting someone else's take on something in an intellectual way? Is there enough material there?
I think what's interesting about this book is it's also talking about what cultural ideas about, like, the famous thing in this book is he's like, he's trying to make a distinction between Dreiser's literature and Henry James's literature, and then he's making this point where he's like, well, people where he comes from the left, look at Dreiser, and he has these themes, these working class themes, and they excuse the defects in his writing and the defects in his worldview because they have this image of him as corresponding with their view of the world. And then they look at Henry James and they dismiss how well the work is because they feel that it's coming from a more genteel place. But if you're really taking your politics seriously, Henry James has a more empathetic view of the world. In his view, Theodore Dreiser's view of the world is very cruel. It's very unsympathetic if you hold it to a real standard. So his view is like, if we're really thinking about our politics in relation to art seriously, you can't hold, it's just a big argument for him. You can't hold Dreiser over Henry James. You might think that corresponds with your politics, but close analysis of it reveals how wrong that is. And you have to look at these things closely and find the real intentions beyond the surface. And I think with comics, because they're not really, those arguments aren't so affecting to our larger culture. It's like if we were like, well, what's, the difference between Daniel Clowes and Julie Doucet? What does this mean for America? I don't really, that would be a leap. Right. But I do think I do think taking comics as seriously as that is definitely important. I mean, it informs my own writing, but I do think the importance he's writing in a time period where these literary debates are very important in wider culture, or at least
where you can smoke on your cover, which is not something that would normally ride. But what you were saying about getting on the bandwagon of someone's character and kind of letting that mask their true behavior or view of the world, letting their fans excuse that behavior when it's unskillful and problematic, we see that play out on the world stage right now. I mean,
yeah, of course.
There's so much of that like bandwagon sloganeering, and it's like, well, I like the idea, the hypothetical idea of that guy I really like, so that's what I want to be, so let's excuse everything he does.
Right, and then if you look, if we're talking about works of art, there might be someone who presents themselves in a way that corresponds to your idea, but if you hold the work to your real standards, there's something in their worldview that might be totally opposed to what the idea is, and I think that's the standard that you have to look to read work with, and so I think you can. There's definitely, I'm not going to name names, but there's definitely cartoonists who I think have a certain persona, and they might seem in line with my ideas of the form, but a real examination of their work reveals something a bit more.
I mean, this has been great.
It's so cool.
I feel like we could talk about this all day. But
thank you so much for having me. It helps me articulate the things that I'm like. I think about this stuff. So
well,
that's
something that's cool that's come out of this process is like talking about things and having to do it in a way where it's recorded, and then you look at it, you edit it, you sit with it, it lives somewhere else. You're able to interact with it in a different way. It does help me formulate my opinions more concisely. It helps me articulate myself.
And I think it adds value to all the work we talk about too, because like everything, I think the artistic value is in the experiencing of it. It's not the work itself, and I think this discussion in particular is like really validating for that thought that this is the good stuff right here.
And I think most of these books are pretty readily available. I think this is out of print but easy to find. This one might be the hard one to get, but I do think because it's wordless, you can get it from the German publisher without too much trouble, and the rest of them are easy books to find.
I've always been a fan of all the comics that you put into the world or help put out into the world, and I didn't know that there was such a lovely, intelligent, sweet persona behind all that. I mean, it's really just such an honor that you're here. Like my life could end tomorrow, so I'm giving you your flowers today.
I'm not gonna respond to that.
I'm just saying. I just mean to say that like I'm gonna be present to the point where it's like I'm so grateful for you to come on because of all those reasons. Like. Thank you so much for coming out.
I had a great time
chatting with us today.
Thank you.
Awesome. Hell yeah. And check out Domino. Check out Austin's work.
Oh, I had one question for you before we go. The picture that you use for your avatar across social media is a black and white photo of a balding man. Who is that man?
That's Mort Weisinger.
Okay.
Whose comics he was an editor for. I mean, the thing that he's most well known for is editing. Kind of at the dawn of the Silver Age in 1958 through the 60s.
I always see that mug looking at me.
He edited the Superman family books for DC, and I think a lot of the ways that people think about that work, they're like, oh, look at this corny cover, Lois Lane's turned into a cupcake or something, this is so stupid. Comics were so corny then, but they were comics that were marketed to children. They sold about 1 million copies a month. They were highly popular.
Wild.
And when you read them, there's a really easy way to read a bunch of them. You can DC was doing those black and white Showcase Presents books that had 500 pages of comics. The first one they did, which had a huge print run, is always easy to find, is Showcase Presents Superman Volume 1. It's the start of the golden era of this Weisinger edited work. I mean, a lot of the stories are written by Otto Binder, people like Edmund Hamilton, There's a lot of Kurt Swan art, Wayne Boring art in it. But he's editing all the stories, and I feel like his editing is so... He was a very cruel person. Maybe one of the cruelest people in comics. There's stories about him. Jim Shooter was one of his writers, and Jim Shooter was 16 at the time, and he would call Jim Shooter at his family's home and say incredibly cruel things to him about not missing deadlines and what an idiot this kid was. And it was very abusive to this young man, and cruel to, I think, most people in his bullpen. But the imagination of those stories, I think, is incredible. They're these very icy stories, but they have these... I think a lot of the concepts that we associate with Superman that are interesting... He's this indestructible character, but how do you tell stories about this character? He innovated a lot of these, ideas about different, it sounds silly, but different modes of how kryptonite works and things. And when you read those stories, they are these amazing puzzles for children that kind of explode with imagination the minute you get into any of them. They're so strange, but I find them not just so readable, but really thrilling to read. I think of, in terms of commercial comics, genre comics, they're some of the best comics I've ever read. I really, one nerdy argument I could have is that I think the Silver Age DC is better than the Stan Lee, Jack Kirby Marvel era, which has obscured it. But yeah, I mean,
that's another conversation we can do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just think he's a brilliant editor, and he's a horrible person. But I like the idea of Mort Weisinger commenting on things, with that. And yeah, he's an imposing looking guy.
Yeah, that mug, I always see it, and I always wondered who that was. But yeah, you'll have to come back and we can talk about matter-eating lad for 2 hours.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do a Mort Weisinger episode.
That'd be great. I mean, we have a comics club on Mondays, and something Joe, the organizer, always talks about is looking at these comics that were written ostensibly for kids, but through a lens of who are the adults making them, what are their philosophies, what are their motivations. That's the conversation. That's the interesting part, and comics has a rich history of comics for young people made by adults with a philosophy and ideology, and trying to pick that apart is really fun.
Yeah, and he's interesting in that mode because I think adults making comics for kids now have this very they're very hey, I'm very palsy kind of, but those DC editors making comics for kids,
cigar chomping monsters,
very not nice people.
There's
letters in the back of them that's why did Lois Lane do this? And it's well, because what you didn't see off panel, you dumb child, don't you just very not very friendly.
That's amazing.
Which stands to reason why then Shooter would turn out to be so problematic.
Yeah.
He was forged in the fires of Weisinger then.
You can read some of his blog entries about working with Weisinger, and it is really heartbreaking.
Yeah,
I mean, it was deeply abusive. Just so that, Shooter comes from, I think, a pretty humble background and was making money from writing these scripts, and I think his family was dependent on the money. And you should look them up. You should look up Jim Shooter, Mort Weisinger, but it's just, it's appalling.
Familiar with Shooter, but just not maybe his origins. I knew he came into comics as a kid, and I knew he wrote scripts when he was very young, before legal age, because I remember hearing stories about his parents having to sign for him, etc. But wild to think about his boss.
He definitely continued the cycle of abuse to a degree.
Yeah, because I hear stories about when he was editor, from the editors that worked under him, who are still here in New York.
He jokes about it in those Valiant comics. He talks about
calling people names and
stuff.
Chained to
their desk for another 72-hour shift.
Right.
Yeah. Well, he's an interesting figure. I mean, he knew how to edit comics in a way.
For sure, he had his style.
He's a big voice.
Well, we started with Anke Fuchtenberger, where Jim Shooter.
With Jim Shooter.
We're going from Criterion to Night Flight.
Let's see. Jim Shooter's okay, well, we got a lot of work to do. This is not done correctly.
All right,
cool.
Jen, great. Wrap that up.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks so much. Toodles.
Bye.
Toodles.